January to March of 2025, police noted a 15.8% increase in kidnappings in Gauteng from the preceding year, with the province accounting for more than 50% of overall incidents in the country. Another worrying trend: last year, Premier Panyaza Lesufi said there was also a concerning number of politically motivated killings in the province, announcing the establishment of a team replicating that of KZN. This week, SAPS announced that 2 units have been established to investigate these 2 crime trends in Gauteng. Let's discuss why these units are important with Chad Thomas from IRS Forensic Investigations. Chad, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this morning. Maybe let's perhaps just get your understanding of the newly established specialized units in the province of Gauteng that will focus on political killings as well as extortions and kidnappings.
A very good morning to you and to the viewers on this Sunday. I think before we get started with the 2 units, it's important to take away what you mentioned at the outset of the insert, and that is the growth in serious crimes in Gauteng, specifically around kidnap for ransom. When one looks at the growth this past quarter from January to March of 2026, it mirrors October to December of 2025. Out of the 4,775 kidnappings reported countrywide at that point, 53% occurred within Gauteng. And that, of course, is of grave concern. Now, what we're seeing with the police in the creation of these types of units is the replication where there's been previous success. So it's not new to have an anti-kidnapping task team. Crime Intelligence National Office established an anti-kidnapping task team under the leadership of Counterintelligence with General Khan some years back that included public-private partnerships, and it focused primarily on kidnap for ransom, and there were quite a few successes. When we talk about the PKTT was made up of organized crime and crime intelligence members, and although established primarily to investigate political killings in KZN, it spread into Gauteng and had some very notable takedowns. It weren't just political killings, but it was killings across the board. There was the mistaken identity of the whistleblower Armand Swart, who was assassinated, together with the assassination of people like DJ Somebody. The Safoka family were engaging with the PKTT, as were others, and it was the PKTT that actually brought people and had them charged in those particular matters. We're seeing the Katie Molefe case, we're seeing the Vusi Kakpatlala case, all as a result of the PKTT becoming involved in Gauteng as well. So they're replicating successes of other units, and that's good. We need to concentrate on where there's success and replicate it, and we need to look where there's failures and to neutralize those failures to make sure that they don't continue. So all in all, we're seeing SAPS taking the serious crime exceptionally seriously. And it's not just the creation of these units that are replicating other successful units. We're also seeing the employment of detectives who resigned or retired with a clean slate being brought back into the fold to bring their experience, to bring their skill set, and to mentor other members that are now in the detective services.
I mean, we know that the local government elections are around the corner, and maybe that's what we could put the rise in political killings to, possibly during this period in Gauteng. Why are we seeing a rise in kidnappings?
Kidnapping is an exceptionally lucrative business. We've had kidnapping in South Africa for years, but not kidnap for ransom specifically. There we've experienced an incredible growth. We actually imported this crime from Mozambique. It was very rife in Maputo, where you had syndicates targeting the Muslim community, and then they came into South Africa. They started in Polokwane, Mosina, Mahikeng, those areas, and then it spread countrywide. And they were targeting people that came from cash-rich environments that worked primarily with cash, such as your cash and carry type businesses, etc. These individuals were targeted in intelligence-driven kidnap for ransom schemes. We're talking tens of millions of rands in ransom that were demanded. So when I say it was intelligence-driven, it was done as an organized crime. It wasn't a copycat kidnapping. It wasn't an express kidnapping like we're also seeing a growth in, but it was a kidnapping that was based on intelligence, that the individuals had money. They came from a community that would rally behind the family and perhaps put more money into the pot for the kidnappers. And they arranged safe houses, they arranged soldiers, they arranged getaway cars, they arranged absolutely everything. So exceptionally well organized. It spread from the Muslim community into other cash-rich communities. When I talk about cash-rich, I'm not talking about moneyed individuals. I'm talking about the nature of their business. So it spread into the Portuguese community, who we know own cash businesses. They own butcher shops. They own fruits and veg. They own liquor stores. And those environments are cash-rich. So the Portuguese started getting targeted. But with the rise in copycat kidnapping, we're now seeing that people are not being kidnapped for tens of millions. People in middle-class suburbia are being kidnapped for hundreds of thousands of rands. And we even seen in informal settlements and the township environment, children being kidnapped for a few hundred or a few thousand rand. So unfortunately, there's been a massive growth in kidnapping as a result of people seeing these huge numbers and the successes that some of these syndicates had when they started their kidnapping for ransom in South Africa.
So when we look at political killings, and given the rise, like we said, at this particular time, and these particularly targeting political figures, will we see these units looking into government officials as well as whistleblowers and those cases in terms of where we then would start to see arrests and prosecutions for those involved?
Definitely. We saw that the PKTT out of KZN expanded their mandate when they realized there was a crossover between political killings and killings of whistleblowers, killings of witnesses, killings of people involved in investigations, liquidators, and so on and so forth. And what we're seeing is that you may have a politically motivated killing that doesn't necessarily target a political figure. One must always remember, when it comes to organized crime, there's a symbiotic relationship between bad actors in the private sector and bad actors in the public sector. And their aim is to plunder the public purse. So when you start investigating people of a political party who may be involved in tender fraud, who may be involved in awarding tenders from a municipal area, even from localized to provincial to national government, the people that get taken out could be politically linked, but are not necessarily politicians. They were involved in that ecosystem and are now getting taken out because they didn't abide by the so-called rules of that organized crime syndicate when it came to the awarding of these so-called corrupt tenders at a local, provincial and national perspective. So I think we need to be very circumspect when we speak about political killings and thinking it's just political figures or people that hold office. There's a whole ecosystem around politicians, both in public sector as well as people in private sector that support corrupt politicians.
And I think at the heart of many of the conversations around these units would be around the funding. I mean, you mentioned that there was a kidnapping unit that was in existence before that was led by General Khan. We saw with the PKTT some of the work that was done there, and just the funds that go towards some of these units, because these are specialized units that bring in an array of specialization in terms of skills that people then come together and find ways out of the ordinary in which we would not find in a normal police station. Do you think we've got enough funding to sustain these units that would see through all the work that is being done to what we actually need and not stop to halt it halfway?
We have sufficient funding. It just isn't given out accordingly. I always use this example. The police budget, I think, has increased to about 140 billion rand per annum. It was sitting at around 100 billion rand per annum. And up until about 2-3 years ago, when you looked at how that budget was allocated, when you looked at priority crime management, which is DPCI, the most important units in our country that fall under the Hawks that have to investigate all the serious crime, they were allocated about 2% of the police budget. So they were getting about 2 billion rand. But conversely, when we looked at VIP protection and security services and blue light brigades, they were getting 3.5% of the annual police budget. So it doesn't make sense. Why do blue light brigades and the security of politicians get almost double that of priority crime investigation? You then also have to look at the Secret Service account within crime intelligence that should be getting used to pay for informants. It should be getting paid for undercover operations. It should be getting used to pay for the infiltration, dismantling, and disrupting of organized crime syndicates. Yet that fund for years and years and years, for decades, and we're talking pre-democracy, we're talking in the security branch days, those funds have been used for ulterior purposes. And we're still seeing that today. So that's a huge whack of money that could be utilized effectively that isn't being utilized effectively. And then also when one sees how the budget is structured, we're seeing less money going to the priority units and more money going to what I would call ego trips of politicians. We don't need the amount of blue light brigades that we have. We don't need the amount of protectors that we have. What we do need are more seasoned and well-trained detectives.
But Chad, I mean, when we look at the Madlanga Commission and all the information that's come out in the last few months, what seems to be a thread is really that infiltration and the involvement of either EMPD or SAPS. We also heard from General Khumalo, who said that 90% of Gauteng police moonlight in cartels at night. How much trust would South Africans have in these units when it's many of those that are within these agencies that are working with organized crime and cartels?
So this is a two-part question. I want to just tackle General Khumalo first. General Khumalo was very reckless when he made that statement that 90% of Gauteng's police officers are corrupt. It was reckless, it was disparaging, and it was demoralizing. If we had 90% corrupt police officers in Gauteng, we'd be a failed state. We're not a failed state. We're going into a local election cycle. We came out of a very successful national election cycle. We have a fiercely independent democracy. We have a fiercely independent media. And we have a judiciary that holds those to account that need to be held to account. So it was a reckless statement. So I think we need to get rid of this perception he created, because there's been no study. I want him to show us the study that 90% of Gauteng's police officers are corrupt. There is no study. It's a thumbsuck. The second thing you said is the infiltration. Yes, it exists. This past week's testimony at both Ad hoc and Madlanga, one thread emerged, and that was gratification. We heard how Richard Shibiri, as the suspended general of organized crime, received a soft loan from Vusi Katpatlala. That is bizarre. That is unbelievable. That is shocking. As the head of organized crime, you would know exactly who Vusi Katpatlala is. You shouldn't be asking for loans from Vusi Katpatlala, a person of interest in multiple investigations. And I think that was the tip of the iceberg. There was no way he could explain that one out because there was a digital trail. Vusi Katpatlala had paid the money into Shibiri's son's account for vehicle repairs, and Shibiri purportedly paid that back. We don't know what was given out in bags, in cash. Then what we saw emerging at Ad hoc was just as concerning. We heard from Advocate Mashoko how the IPID process had been flawed in that while the executive director McBride had been on suspension, Paul O'Sullivan paid his legal fees to get him reinstated, 200,000 Rand. Again, that's a gratification, because when you see McBride come back into IPID, you now see unfettered access for Sarah Jane Trent and for Paul O'Sullivan into IPID's operations. And then, of course, we hear about what could be termed gratification in terms of the irregular relationship between Sarah Jane Trent and Robert McBride. So one thing that's clearly emerged is that gratification can take multiple forms. And we've seen this thread now emerge this past week. And there's definitely infiltration, and there's definitely gratification that needs to be answered to. Hence, we have the legislation, the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act, that lists all types of gratifications, including soft loans, including monies paid for legal expenses, and so on and so forth.
You mentioned, Chad, that with the success of some of the previous units, it's because of a collaboration between private and public partnerships. How important is it that with these units that then would be formed in Gauteng, that there would be private players that come in and assist, especially when it comes to forensic investigations?
You know, it's such a difficult subject when one sees how private individuals could be bad actors that have infiltrated the law enforcement agencies on the pretext that they want to do good. So that's why it has to be formalized in some manner or fashion. And we have a formalization through Business Against Crime South Africa known as the E2 project. The E2 project allows for the security industry to be force multipliers for SAPS. And it's formalized. It means there's governance in place, there's accountability in place, and there's transparency in place. You can't have informal relationships taking place, because that's when it becomes a gray area, and that's where people abuse the relationship that they may have with the authorities. Like we saw with Vusi Katpatlala, that purportedly wanted to sponsor vehicles for EMPD, but there was an agenda at play and there was another narrative at play. When you look at BAXA, Business Against Crime South Africa, and the E2 project, it's formalized, it's done properly, force multipliers on the ground. They have a war room that they use, as a joint operational center with SAPS. They work on cash in transits together. They work on ATM bombings together. They work on kidnap for ransoms together. They work on murder for hire together, and it tends to work. Then you have other organizations like the CCIN, which is a body made up of security companies that again support the local law enforcement from a crime intelligence perspective. That is assisting because there's a lot of resources in the private sector. But what's important to understand is that any public-private partnership has to be formalized. Informal calls for gray areas, calls for problems, and then we see what happened in EMPD. And we can't have that replicating itself around the country.
Most certainly. Chair Thomas, always a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you for your insights.